I'm trying to kill two birds with one stone, as it were, on the question of is there sort of a ground of philosophy prior to any particular logos, in the Dugin question? What does Dugin mean by philosophy? And then on the other hand, what is the essence of Strauss's objection, or if it is an objection, to the Epicureans and their doctrine? So I think the essence of it is that Strauss sees this sort of ancient crystallization, or say a kind of plaque in the neuronal plaque of Epicureanism, as continuing to have a sort of zealous adherence with kind of ferocious proficiency in their new expressions of the old form. So this Strauss views as a kind of a barrier to actual philosophizing, because there's some kind of plaque buildup that's there, and it won't give way to what Heidegger would call the originary, let's say, investigation. To give it, Strauss usually speaks of investigation. Strauss says, in this, I think, when he compares Nietzsche to Socrates, and then he seems to imply that Socrates was the first to raise the question of the human being properly, not just the Greek, but the human being, and that Nietzsche has somehow reawoken the first moment of this inquiry. So then one can ask, one could state it this way: in the second cave, in the cave of history, there's this thing called Epicureanism, and then one can ask the more subtle question, which arose sort of not too long after Platonism, alongside Stoicism. There's an analogy to be made with the development in China, but let me state this first. So then one can ask whether the first cave is also in the second cave. So because was it that Plato, when you think of his repeated insistence about the difficulties we can get in with language, that language always says the same thing again and again, was there already in the first cave, the doctrine of the first cave, did something of a unphilosophic, or as Strauss puts it, an unradical crystallization occur, so that even the first cave is already in the threshold of history, and the second cave, history, is the chief subject in some way in Heidegger. Heidegger speaks actually of faith in history. So if we speak of the faith in history, then we've, in some way, it would seem, given up going to the moment when Socrates first raises the radicality of the question of the human being, or the origin of philosophizing. Some other questions would come in then about the so-called pre-Platonics or pre-Socratics and so on. And also one might remember that whenever we say something good about Plato-Socrates, we usually use the name Socrates. Whenever we say something bad about Plato-Socrates, we tend to say Plato the dogmatist, Plato the one that got the trouble started with Platonism, which then became, according to Nietzsche, Christianity, as Platonism for the masses, and etc. So how does that work? Look at it in the Chinese example. So I learned from what's his name? Tu Weiming, I think, the contemporary Chinese philosopher, that even though there was a guy called Confucius, he basically took over a pre-existing teaching or tradition, and his name was written on it as a rubric. There was an actual Confucius. He played a role in Confucianism, but he took over a tradition that went way back before him. In some way, therefore, Confucius is analogous to Plato, and with respect to the pre-Platonics, which then includes Socrates, or the pre-Socratics. And then along comes, so maybe it doesn't seem intuitive for some of us. It seems like the Tao Te Ching or Lao Tzu's book seems older somehow, because it's of a more radical, primitive character in a certain sense, the way. But the claim is that it came in a way which is somewhat analogous to Stoicism as a reaction to Confucianism. Confucianism raised some ideas and placed them in a way that men could think about them, and then people said, well, what about this radical antithesis to that, which is it's more clear sort of in the Western version. The Stoics say we should actually follow nature. Where Nietzsche says, if by nature you mean what's already happening, what comes forward of its own, then you're already doing that no matter what. So you must mean by nature some invention of your own. Similarly, somehow you can see that in the Taoism, where they say, well, if you follow the way, then even if you transgress, what would they be transgressing? Well, the law, or what Confucius says, or what some dogmatist says. Even if you transgress, you will go unpunished. So that names a kind of very inadequately, you could say, like a super flow state where everything goes right, and maybe slightly like what was intended by that film Unlimited. I believe something on those lines is thought by the idea of the way, the perfect personality, but not in anything like a Western sense of at the top of the hierarchy, but rather at every ushering in of a new moment, one slips through the right keyhole. One rights oneself when one goes wrong. Likewise, the Motsu's teaching is very similar to the communist and third position thinking behind the Epicureanism. So it's very interesting that the same kind of dogmatic teaching, Confucianism, and then these other constellations can be shown at least in a rough sketch. Then, of course, one could say you are merely a man with a hammer who only knows how to think in these Western terms, and therefore you place that on top of the Eastern thinking and so forth. I mean, quite validly, but of course then we're limited by our own perspective, as Nietzsche would say. So I think this does, however, solve the essential issue of why Strauss is worried about the Epicureanism per se, because he would be worried about Platonism in any modern Platonist. If any modern Platonist says, I know who Plato is, Strauss would probably say this is the Plato of a 17th century thinker, or this is the Plato of a profound I mean, he grants that Thomas More was a very profound and good student of Plato, but he was part of the second cave, so he wouldn't have direct access to that first moment. So then, with regard to Epicureanism, there also we could go into other reasons. For instance, the general reasons why Machiavelli, I think it's in the 15th chapter where he declares that something similar to Nietzsche saying that truth is a woman, but basically that you can conquer all these difficulties of, I guess, stochastic, practical difficulties by your knowledge of history, by an inductive knowledge of history that you'd then put together, and in a pragmatic way, you'd solve the problems. Technocratic solutions today often have this kind of look. And then the problem is, again, one doesn't allow for full entry into the problem. But I guess even more from Strauss's point of view, the problem would be, instead of looking at the human being, you look at the biological entity. Like, for instance, you compare nature to nature, and on the one side there's just what's happened, so that some species was very violent. It did all kinds of things that we consider horrible by the current standard right this moment. And then there's some second human being which exists both somehow painted on the neuron and on the external thing that we see, so that to say that the human being which is outside is in the neuron is true, but who cares? Because that's not where what the human being is changes and gets its first identity. It gets its first identity somehow from being, according to Plato's teaching, being the what. But in Heidegger, we seem to have this tantalizing hope of getting close to where that is occurring. But a study of that side of it, the side of what the thing is somehow ruled out when we only look at the technocratic solutions. For example, the nudge theory, that if you change the frequency of the lines in the center of the road, it will give somebody the impression they're going faster, and therefore they'll slow down, and other similar utilitarian solutions. So ultimately, Epicureanism is utilitarianism. So this is John Stuart Mill, for instance, is, I would say, essentially doing a hedonistic calculus in his book on utilitarianism. It's very clear, and where he, of course, comes to the finding that the intellectual virtues which he himself possessed were the source of the most certain and the most regular hedonic rewards. But in any case, we can go more into this subject. And I would hope maybe people would say where I failed to say anything that's clear enough to be of any use.